Hi, I want to welcome you to the first session of the Story of God, Part 1. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be exploring major themes and events in the Hebrew Bible. But don't worry, we've only got 6 weeks, so we're not going to be doing a verse-by-verse exposition or really kicking the ball into the weeds. This is more of looking at the Old Testament from a 10,000-foot view, so that if and when you want to begin reading the Bible on your own, you can have a big picture framework to situate major figures and stories. And as you might have imagined, since there's a Story of God Part 1, there will be a Story of God Part 2, where we look at the stories of Jesus, and there might even be a Story of God Part 3, where we look at the story of the church. You might be wondering, with everything going on in the world, why have I chosen to talk about the Old Testament? After all, most of us have an impression of the Old Testament that is sometimes less desirable. We think of God smiting people, or the earth opening up and swallowing the unrighteous, or God commanding the Israelites to carry out genocide against the Canaanites. But during the pandemic, I came across a survey from Pew Forum, which is a reputable organization, and they did a survey on religious knowledge in America. The survey is about religious knowledge in general, but there were sections that were specifically about Christianity and the Bible, and they were able to analyze all the different responses and information. And I discovered, after looking at the survey, that Protestant and Catholic Christians scored lower in areas of Christianity and the Bible than atheists and agnostics. And so on one hand, I want to commend our friends who don't necessarily subscribe to any particular faith for being invested enough to understand why we believe what we believe. But on the other hand, it's a little bit disheartening that based upon these numbers, we don't know our story very well. And with everything going on in the world, it's caused me to pause a little bit and realize that we need to know our story. That sometimes when we think of the Bible, we think of things that happened in the past, or we look at the book of Revelation and we think that it's about things that are going to happen in the future, but we rarely see it as a story that is unfolding in our midst. And I think that's the kind of book that it is. It's a story that's happening, and as the people of God, we're supposed to be living out that story. And probably for most of us, if there's ever been a time in our life that we needed to know the story of God, that we needed to know how to live it out as the people of God, it's right now. It might be hard for some of us to believe that we would not do so well on a quiz about Christianity in the Bible, where we would score somewhere around a D. Because many of us, baby boomers and Generation X and even millennials like me, went to a lot of Christian education opportunities outside of Sunday morning worship. So Sunday school, Vacation Bible School. I was a part of a Bible memorization club from the time that I was 3 years old through the 6th grade. And so it seems kind of difficult to imagine, how is it possible that some of us just don't know the Bible all that well. And here's what I think happens. Sunday school teachers have a really difficult job trying to communicate scripture to squirmy kids who are moving all over the place, who have a great imagination. And so in order to keep their attention, they're kind of selective about the stories that are told. We focus on telling stories about animals and miracles and legendary figures like Samson and David slaying Goliath. And I think of this method as being very episodic, meaning that we have all these little bits and pieces of the story, but by the time that we become youth and adolescents, we don't really have a way of connecting all the different pieces to tell one big overarching story. And so while the story of David slaying Goliath is something that really sticks in our memory, it's important to know that that's a part of a bigger picture. And the best analogy for me is to think about a mosaic. I'm just really intrigued and fascinated by them because there are all these tiny little pieces, and sometimes these tiny little pieces tell a story of their own, but they're also connected to a much bigger picture. And we need to be able to look at those little pieces within the context of the larger story. And because a lot of times our portrait of the Bible is episodic, we don't always get the big picture. We just have a bunch of these tiny little pieces and we're not sure what to do with them. Now, as I've already shared with you, I grew up in church, and when I was 18, I began attending a Bible college where I studied the Bible academically and in depth, and it was at that point in my life that I started learning about this event in the Hebrew Bible called the Exile. We think of it as a lot of times it's called the Babylonian Exile, and it's a little bit complicated because there are actually two exiles, because there are actually two nations of Israel. One is in the north, and it's the northern kingdom of Israel, and the other kingdom in the south is the kingdom of Judah. And both of these kingdoms experience an exile. The northern kingdom goes into exile in 722 BC with the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom goes into exile in 586. I never heard about all of this stuff as a kid, and I've come to the conclusion it's because there aren't any stories about animals or miracles or any legends. It's kind of just dry history. But I've also come to the conclusion that not only is the exile perhaps the most neglected event in the Old Testament, it's also the most important event of the Old Testament. And so I had this huge piece of the puzzle missing, this big gaping hole. And after learning more about it, it changed the way that I understood the entire Bible. It changed the way that I understood what it meant for Jesus to come into the world, to be the Messiah. And so that's the power of a biblical narrative, is that these tiny little pieces shape and move and change everything. In more recent years, I've come to think of this event called the Babylonian Exile as the wagon wheel of the Old Testament. It's the center of the story, and it's the place where all the spokes both meet and branch out. Because it was during this period, around the 6th century BC, that the story of God was finally put into written form. Now, in my opinion, some of these dates, a lot of these dates are kind of arbitrary. I don't think that we can really trust anything until we get to about 1000 BC. That's whenever David's reign begins. But all of these events, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Abraham and Moses and David, the story of the kingdoms, all of this is being told from the perspective of the exile. Everything's being told through that lens. And you'll notice these prophets, who we don't really dig into a whole lot, they tend to be fairly neglected. They take up a huge portion of the Old Testament, but they revolve around this event called the exile. We call some of them pre-exilic, and some of them post-exilic, and some of them exilic, because they all revolve around the Babylonian exile. The pre-exilic prophets, as I mentioned before, there were actually two kingdoms, the north and the south. The pre-exilic prophets were warning the kingdoms about the impending judgment, that if they didn't turn from their unrighteousness and their rebellion, they were going to be removed from the land and taken into judgment. So it's a lot of warning. Some of it is talking about returning to the land, but for the most part, it is about warning. And then you've got exilic prophets who are written during the actual exile. And so you think of the story of Daniel, who was thrown into the lion's den because he was trying to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, while he was living in a foreign land. And so the story of Daniel is told as a way to encourage Jewish people. He's used as an example of this is how you're supposed to live when you're in exile. This is what it looks like to be faithful, how to be a faithful Jew living outside of the land of Israel. And then you've got the post-exilic prophets, which are primarily focused on how the people of God are supposed to return to their nation, to fortify their cities, to rebuild their communities, to rebuild the temple. And all of these prophets correspond with these narratives here. So the post-exilic prophets, they correspond with Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the stories about the people of God returning to the land. This is the wagon wheel. It's the place where we see the story of God coming together after generations and generations of passing it down orally. It's finally put into written form, which leads the majority of scholars to believe that we shouldn't really be reading the Old Testament as history in the way that we would in a modern sense. We're not looking for objective history, but it's a theological story. As one biblical scholar we're going to look at in just a moment calls it history reimagined. Walter Brueggemann is arguably the most respected Old Testament scholar still living. And in his introduction to the Old Testament, he talks about this process of taking traditional material and shaping it and passing it down from generation to generation, basically the way that the Old Testament is written. And he says, remembering, moreover, is itself shot through with imaginative freedom to extrapolate and move beyond whatever there may have been of happening. Sometimes that imaginative reconstrual is intentional in order to permit the memory to be pertinent to a new generation. For example, it's possible that the Exodus narrative in Exodus 1 through 15 contains exilic materials in order that the later generation of the 6th century exile might understand the Exodus memory in terms of its own emancipation from Babylon. The exile, it's the wagon wheel. It's the place where the rest of the story is told. It's the vantage point of how everything in Israel's history is remembered. So let's look at another story really briefly, a story that most of us know pretty well. But before we do, let me give you a little bit of context. You might remember that the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years when God sent in this liberator, Moses, to free the Israelites from Egypt, to lead them to the promised land of Canaan, the land that was promised to their forefather Abraham. God promised to Abraham that he would make this great nation, and this nation would in turn bless all the other nations of the earth. And so after the Israelites escaped from Egypt, they were in the wilderness where they wandered around for 40 years. And it was during this time that God gave them a covenant. Yahweh, the God of Israel, gave them this contract that he would deliver them to the land, that they would be able to inhabit the land and live there as blessed people as long as they followed the law of Moses. But if they chose to take matters into their own hands, if they chose to live their own way, they would be exiled from the land. They would be taken out of the land. They would be cursed. So, one biblical scholar named Pete Enns suggests that the story of Adam and Eve is actually a parable about the nation of Israel. Adam is really Israel. Adam receives the commands of God, and instead of following the commands of God, chooses to do things his own way. And as a result, he is exiled from paradise, this perfect place that God has prepared for him. Now, Pete Enns, who is a professor at Eastern University, he didn't come up with this on his own. He found a tradition in Second Temple Judaism of rabbis interpreting the story this way, and so it's not really anything new. Sometimes we read this story in a prescriptive way, as if it is imposed on all of humanity, but I think it's supposed to be read in a more descriptive way. In other words, I think it's descriptive of all of us, that all of us know what's right and wrong. We know to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We know how to follow our conscience and the law that God has placed upon our hearts, but a lot of times we choose to do things our own way. We choose to take our own path. And as a result, we end up living in spiritual exile. We end up living outside of the blessing and prefer to live in the wilderness. This is a snapshot of the Old Testament. This is what the story looks like from 10,000 feet. I hope that you'll join us next time.